It's a beautiful day in Western Washington. That's what I meant to say. Very, very pretty. Let's make a video. Hi, Owlets. It is a gorgeous sunny day here on the island, and I have been trying to make this video for a few days now, so I'm gonna get it done. I'm gonna get it done today. We are at the beach, enjoying the lovely sunshine and the breeze. The mountain is out. I will flip you guys around and show you my my wonderful view. I'm gonna try and keep this video short, but I have a lot to say, and let's just jump into it. Let's just do it. For those of you who are new here, welcome. I hope this was a pleasant conversation. And for those of you who are returning, thanks for joining us. Last month, we were talking a lot about religious trauma. And there was a lot of discussion about switching paths and conversion and, you know, a lot of different opinions based around the lady grave dancer switching back to Christianity, and Sunshine Morning Rays response to my videos, and how, for lack of a better word, traumatizing that video was. If you haven't watched those, whatever. But the discussion involving religious trauma came up with that whole situation and victim blaming and all of that. There were things that were said that I want to address here again from a different perspective. And, you know, this cancer doesn't let things go. So you can call it me stirring the pot and be tired of the subject, and we can talk about how we just want everybody to get along and all of that nice stuff. And I agree, but again, this is stuff that has to be discussed. So I'll also be referencing a lot of my past videos in this video, so at any point, feel free to pause, go back and watch any of my previously made videos that I may mention, so you can get kind of the whole story or the whole picture. Let's just talk about it. And sorry if not looking at the camera bothers you. I'm just, you know, normally when I come out for walks and stuff, I just take in the beauty, and today is an exceptionally beautiful day, so I am distracted. Religious trauma. First, what is religious trauma? When I looked up the definition of religious trauma, it's basically any situation in which religion causes distress, causes destructive behavior, or causes stress on a person or a practitioner of that religion. I will go ahead and put the actual dictionary.com definition up at some point. But basically, that is religious trauma. And I also thought it was very, very interesting that the term religious trauma has only been coined since about 2011 or 2010, somewhere around there, which is like surprising to me, simply because history is already so packed full of religious persecution and traumatic situations like the Inquisition and the Salem witch trials. I mean, just looking from a witch's perspective, not to mention the Holocaust and a whole bunch of other situations. It's really surprising to me that religious trauma is a term that only dates back to about 13 years, give or take, which means it's relatively young. It's a young term. One thing that I want to make sure we are not doing in the discussion with this video is like trauma bonding, or, well, I guess trauma bonding is one thing, but comparing traumas. And I don't want this to be a discussion of, well, my trauma is way more, you know, effective than yours, or my trauma is more valid than yours, because one thing I want to make sure that we get out of the way here is that everybody's trauma is valid. And that's part of the argument from last month's videos as well, is like a lot of people don't realize, oh, just because somebody says that they were hurt does not mean it needs to be defended, or it does not mean it needs to be questioned. And that's the most invalidating thing you can ever do to somebody with trauma, I think, is try to invalidate their experience. So let's not do that anymore, right? But let's just have a conversation about religious trauma, and not only how it can arise, but also mostly how we might be able to work through it, right? Because I see a lot of videos on social media, a lot of videos on YouTube made by pagans regarding their social trauma and how, you know, they experienced it, but not necessarily how they are working through it or trying to get past it, or, you know, however you want to put that. Let me also remind everyone that I am not a professional therapist. I am not a psychologist. I am not a professional human by any means. I am just a human with eye allergies who is sitting at the beach, watering out of one eye, and talking about my experiences with religious trauma, and hoping that maybe it will start a creative conversation or give some people some inspiration or ideas as to how to work through their own religious trauma. So let's start back to when I first discovered witchcraft, right? Sounds like a sea lion out there roaring. But,
What are you talking about? My God, pull yourself together!
Let's start with when I first discovered witchcraft. I have a whole video, maybe 2 videos actually, about how I found my path as a witch. And rather than retell the story for a 3rd time, I'm going to suggest that you guys go check out those videos. I know there's a lot of new people on the channel, so maybe that will be something that will interest some of you newcomers. And it will give you some background to me in general. So I figure it'll be a good thing. But basically, long story short, paraphrasing here, I found Wicca first.
Nobody around here really appreciates my taste in weird stuff. Encouragement, not good. No. And you know what else? I have deja vu a lot. I mean, like, all the time.
Really? Well, you know, if you could practice...
Mother, could I talk to you in the kitchen for just 1 minute?
Absolutely, dear. As soon as I get the children into their costumes.
Costume?
Wow! And the ghost. Oh, yeah. Oh, yes, this is the winner.
I'm a Wiccan. I'm a ghost. I think I'm a big pimple.
Soon discovered that Wicca was not a good path for me to be on, so I basically used it as a stepping stone. As far as my religious trauma, I've experienced religious trauma both as a practicing witch from a young age, as well as from a gay perspective or a queer perspective. So for those of you who say you can imagine, you may be able to imagine, but one thing we need to keep in mind with this channel is that we can imagine as much as we'd like, but that doesn't mean that we fully understand. So unless you have walked in my shoes or someone else's shoes who is of a queer flavor, then you will not completely understand their experience, which was another issue from last month's videos that we came across, but that's fine. Moving forward. What I mean by you will never understand. So as a queer person growing up, I grew up in Southern Ohio. And while no, it wasn't really part of the heavy Bible Belt, there were still very prevalent churches everywhere around on like every corner. It's fair share of religious people. And I don't want to sit here and say that Catholicism or Christianity is the only culprit to religious trauma, because it definitely is not. But titties. But it definitely doesn't help situations, right? So let's preference that as well. Let's take Trina's video last month, for example. You know, that was traumatic on a religious standpoint because she's discussing the pagan community at large, and it was trauma. It made people uncomfortable. That's religious trauma. So I've had my fair share of religious trauma, as I'm sure everybody else who's watching this video has as well. But what are some of the things that I have done in the past that have kind of helped me get over it? Or how have I worked through it? I wouldn't say get over it, because I think that trauma isn't really something you just get over, right? And that's another subject from last month that I would like to touch up on is, you know, there were a lot of people that were like, well, you know, individuals are responsible for their own triggers and their own religious trauma. And while to some extent I agree with that, I also think that as a community, right, as a community, we should all be mindful of people's triggers and traumas. So that way, if somebody is triggered or trauma, you know, does come into response, then maybe we can help them like calm down and not necessarily just be like, well, that's their responsibility, that's their business, and leave them to suffer through it. Just me, just my idea. So one thing I did to overcome religious trauma, which, you know, again, my family was not very super religious, but I discuss in my past videos about how, you know, my mom and my aunt would question me when I would bring up things like reincarnation or numerology. And from a young age, I would get questioned to the extent of, well, is that what you believe? Because if that's what you believe, you're wrong. I would get shut down. And not necessarily aggressively, but I don't think a person has to be shut down aggressively to be traumatized, to feel like they've done something wrong, especially a sensitive little water sign like me. So there's that. I think that being raised to believe in a patriarchal system where God is male and there are no female equivalents, and being raised in a household where it was very gender conforming and heteronormative. And what I mean by that is that the wife takes care of the household and cooks and cleans, and the husband goes off to work, just has to work and come home and bring the money home, and, you know, the wife has to raise the kids and all of that. I think being raised in that sort of nuclear American household or family upbringing kind of traumatized, in a way, my queer, gender-bending childhood personality forming. Not trying to compare traumas, but I think that I was lucky. You know, I often say I was lucky enough to be raised by my parents, because even though they were gender confirming and even even though they were heteronormative, and even though there were some, you know, bumping of heads there, for the most part, I was still allowed to express myself when I wanted to express myself. It was just very much only during specific situations could I make it, known without being labeled as gay or without being labeled as some. One story that I like to reference or bring up when talking about my upbringing and my being queer is when I was very, very young. Halloween has always been one of my favorite holidays or times of the year.
Why are you so obsessed with Halloween? I mean, it's just like Mom says. It gives little kids dumb ideas about there being magic. Like, that helps them prepare for life. Personally, give me a good nature documentary any day.
Halloween is cool, nature boy. I mean, it's exciting, strange, and ancient.
And I think that this story will kind of explain why. My mom took me to like a store, like a Family Dollar or a Dollar Tree or something, and we were picking out Halloween costumes, or I was, and I picked out the Pink Power Ranger.
Hi, I'm Kimberly, the Pink Ranger. I have become like so popular, guys are always swooping over me. It must be my more phenomenal costume. Plus, the helmet's like a real lifesaver when I'm having a bad hair day. When I'm off fighting gross monsters, I call on the power of the totally awesome pterodactyl.
Because in the 90s, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers were a popular thing when I was a kid. So I picked out the Pink Power Ranger. Now, my mom, I remember taking me up to the register to purchase the costume, and the cashier at the register was a woman, and she tried to convince my mom to talk me into getting a different costume. And I remember my mom wasn't very aggressive with it, but she was like, I remember her asking the cashier, like, well, why would I try and talk him out of this? This is what he wants to be. And then I remember the cashier basically saying something like, well, are you sure? Did you ask him? And my mom was like, Nathan, is this the costume you wanna be for Halloween? And I said, yes. And she said, do you want to choose a different color? And I said, no, I want to be the Pink Power Ranger. And she said, okay. And she looked at the cashier and was just kind of like, So the cashier was like, oh, okay, well, are you sure, little boy, that you don't want it? And I was like, no, I want to be the Pink Power Ranger.
There's too many of them. Let's do it, guys. Right. It's morphin' time.
So kudos to my mom for doing that, because that took bravery. It's not easy to do, when society is involved and when society questions you. It's not an easy thing to do, to stand up against society and be like, you know what, no. So with that being said, from a queer perspective of things, I think that's one reason why I gravitated towards Wicca so much. Because first of all, it was the most readily available thing that was witchy, and I always considered myself witchy or of a magical, perspective or a magical flavor. And I know that's really tacky to say nowadays. And also let me say that none of my family were inherently witches from the get-go, at least not that I can attest to. I say my granny practiced granny magic, but really granny magic is a form of folk magic that is traditionalized, but not so much its own tradition of witchcraft. In fact, if you were to go to my granny or any of her relatives that practiced herbalism or, anything like this, and you were to ask them if they were witches, they would look at you like you were crazy, and they would probably get very upset with you because they went to church. They carried a Bible, their book of spells was the Bible, was Psalms, was prayer, and that's something I think that we all need to remember as well when we talk about witchcraft. And like, there's been a lot of discussion lately with what is traditional and what isn't. But that's another discussion that kind of started up from last month's videos, is like traditional witchcraft or traditions of witchcraft versus, you know, solitary practitioners, and the pros and cons of both. And, you know, it kind of brought up, why am I solitary versus in a tradition right now? And I have studied some traditions. I've looked into some of the fairy traditions. I've studied some of, like, I was in Black Rose witchcraft tradition for a while. I was studying up on that. Can't really say that I was in it because I wasn't initiated, but, and like, when it comes to American tradcraft, I know a bit about it, but I'm not a member of a coven or anything like that. And some of the discussion with what happened with the Lady Grave Dancer and Sunshine Morning Ray was like, well, this is why it's a good thing to have a tradition. It's a good thing to have a coven, because then you have people who actually have proof of the work that they've done, or they've actually worked some sort of program to get them up to the status that they've been in, rather than just, you know, coming across it via just, you know, likes and views on social media and that sort of thing, which is definitely a pro to traditional witchcraft. Your spiritual leaders, to some extent, are vetted in that sense. Also, like, when it came to my ancestors, none of my ancestors, if they practiced witchcraft, which I'm sure if you go back far enough, they did at some point, or they practiced some sort of magic. If you go back far enough, they probably were not of a greater tradition, you know. We now think of witches as, you know, a minority of a greater population back then of what would have been, you know, the priests or what have you. So not everybody walked a priest's path. It wasn't until Christianity became a thing that covens really became necessary, in my opinion, because, you know, why need to have a close-knit group of people that keep your secrets or keep your practice secrets, if you go back far enough, when everybody for the most part practiced it? You know, that's how I think of it, you know. But anyway, regardless to say, looking back on things, I've always kind of held a little bit of, like, I've always kept organized religions at an arm's length, I guess, because there were parts of it that just made me feel kind of like, ooh, that doesn't feel right, or ooh, that doesn't feel great. And I guess it's because we're taking something as organic and as fluid as spirituality, and with organized religion, we're literally trying to put it in a box, and we're trying to conform it to everybody's ideals and feelings, and you're just never gonna, that's never going to succeed. There's always going to be somebody who feels a little bit differently. And I guess maybe it's the fact of, like, well, maybe if that person feels differently, that's why they should go into a different church or start their own church. But the thing is like, to me, to start a church and to be vetted as a church, you have to get other people on your side. And oftentimes, to get people on your side, you have to be vetted from the church that you're branching off from. And that alone seems kind of like, I don't know, like aggressive or shady to me. But I guess my advice for where to start when it comes to working through religious trauma is patience and allowing yourself the freedom to explore. When I started practicing Wicca and studying Wicca, I was avoiding the patriarchal aspects of creation or deity. I was also avoiding giving my deities any type of names. So I was working with deity from a very abstract perspective. So God was God, goddess was goddess. The universe was the creator, or what have you. Just be patient, give yourself room to explore, because once I was brave enough to explore a more masculine energy in my practice or my craft, I was more likely to see that masculine isn't necessarily hard, isn't necessarily tough. You know, for me, the warrior aspect is a goddess aspect, just as much as it is a God aspect. And with my matron being, with my patron being the Doctor, you know, this is a god who the Irish recognized as being able to take away life, but also give life. And I think that's part of it, while at the same time recognizing that it's not always just about reproduction as well, because that's another thing. Like, we look back at ancient cultures and we like to think that the god represented hunting and the goddess represented, you know, home and hearth, and it was very gender conforming, gender roles, stuff like that. But really, if you think about it, the ancient people also didn't really think that way, and neither do we as modern people, especially. You know, my seed will never be used to reproduce. That's a decision that my husband and I made personally, and we know that it will never be used to reproduce. It doesn't really make sense for me to conform all of my religious beliefs, and even involving nature, around just reproduction. And I guess that's a big reason why I've kind of gotten over a lot of my religious trauma, because a lot of it is actually becoming more comfortable with yourself than becoming more comfortable with whatever it is that you're wanting to work with.
These words, chapter 12, the very end of it, it's called The Veil Removed. This is the ineffable secret, the ultimate illumination, the key to peace and power. You are God. Those are the three magic words. If you will accept this towering truth and dare to stand atop this magnificent pinnacle, universal consciousness will be revealed to you from within. God is there. It is He who peers from behind your eyes, who is your own consciousness, who is your very self.
My husband also asked me to make a bit of a video about this because he is starting his own pagan path, and he often asks me a lot of questions like, well, how do you know if it's a god, or how do you know if it's this, or how do you know if it's that? And I think that for him, he wants to he wants to be proven that he's not crazy when he has experiences. And the thing is like, nobody knows, right? Like, even we as humans, science is not even an exact science most of the time. I mean, look at what I said about the term religious trauma. It's only 10 years old. You know, we're only just now coming to terms with the fact that religious upbringing can cause traumatic experiences that sometimes have an effect on us throughout our whole lives. So what I would do is I would encourage you to look at nature. What speaks to you? Really do some internal searching to determine what speaks to you, what things have you always liked. Get back in touch with your inner child and really just give yourself the allowance and the freedom to be able to explore and feel the way you feel. Give yourself permission to feel the way you feel. And keep working through it. Don't give up. I think I'm gonna stop here because I've said a lot of things and I think I have at least 30 minutes of video to edit down, but I would love to continue this conversation in the comments. And until next time, many blessings, lots of love, and a lot of darkness.